welcome to this week's Riks Round Up by Riks Europe. My name is Hannah, and today I am joined by political commentators Peter Klipp and Elias Nordgren. Welcome back.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
We have some interesting topics to discuss today. We will start with the EU that's seeking a rapid solution to finance Ukraine's military and financial needs for coming years. Secondly, we will talk about the EU that's tightening rules on cheap Chinese imports by scrapping the minimums about to prevent unfair competition. And lastly, we will talk about the EU again that's rolling back green policies as European People's Party teams up with the far right. Can we start with the first topic? Can you help us out a little bit more, Peter?
Yeah, sure. So this is a big deal. The European Commission just published its proposals on how European countries can continue to help Ukraine finance the war, the defensive war for Ukraine against Russia. Now, according to the Commission, there's three options. Either member states can simply send money to Ukraine and basically borrow cash to pay for that. Option number two is that European countries together jointly issue a loan. That of course would mean that sort of the financially weaker member states can profit off the backs of the financially stronger ones. That's not exactly something that is seen as positive because it can give some bad incentives. And then the third option, according to the European Commission, is that a number of Russian assets that are frozen in Europe, specifically in Belgium with company Euroclear, that these assets are effectively being confiscated and used to transfer to Ukraine. Now, the Commission doesn't claim it will confiscate the assets. It wants to do this in a, let's say, rather complicated way, which amounts to the same. It will use those assets to, lend money to Ukraine, and Russia will get its money back if it pays back Ukraine for all the war damage after the war. But of course, given that there's no agreement with Russia on this, legally amounts to a confiscation, which is the reason why Belgium, which is hosting the company where all the assets are frozen, is against this, rightly so, in my opinion. Why? Because a lot of these assets are not actually Russian assets. It's often Western banks owning those assets, for example, claims on the Russian state. Secondly, also non-Russian citizens and Russian citizens that have nothing to do with Putin. So you can question if this is fair, let alone legal. More importantly, is that of course Putin and Russia and Russian client states, they can also seize a lot of Western assets that are still on their territory if they want to. So obviously, if Europe would continue with this plan, this is likely what's going to happen. Russia is also going to try to legally challenge Belgium over this, and perhaps most importantly, non-European countries like China, like the Arab economies, Asian economies that have been parking assets in the West. They will be much less inclined to do so if we start disrespecting property rights. So this is a very dangerous plan, I think.
Yeah, and this sets a obviously terrible precedent, really. Regardless about how you feel about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that should ring some alarm bells. That there are so many parts of the European establishment that are seriously considering this to be a legitimate option, which I would posit that it is absolutely not legitimate to confiscate assets arbitrarily in this way in order to fund this war. To keep this slaughter machine going. I mean, obviously, if Europe wants to act as a geopolitical agent, which and by Europe I mean the EU in this case, which they first of all shouldn't for a number of reasons. But if they want to act as a geopolitical agent, they should probably try to negotiate with Russia. They should probably try to do this in a less underhanded way, in a way that doesn't undermine their credibility as a, as a monument to like the rule of law, which they would often like to portray themselves as. But this not only confirms that the EU is, increasingly being tempted by all of these very arbitrary measures and, potentially illegal measures in order to pursue its geopolitical goals. It also shows that it is becoming a geopolitical bloc more so than just a trading cooperation organization. It's increasingly embroiled in these wars, in the internal economic matters of the member states, in order to pursue indirectly military goals. That's what we've been experiencing during the Ukraine war. I mean, we have a lot of obviously some countries in the EU, such as Slovakia and Hungary, they don't wish to contribute for geopolitical and other political reasons. They're essentially being blackmailed by the EU to contribute anyway, or they're being like isolated politically and socially from the rest of the EU due to their stances on this. But this is not, driving this war, driving the defense of Ukraine, which could be it's obviously a legitimate issue for a lot of people in Europe. That should not be one of the EU's competencies. And I'm actually surprised that there are not stronger reactions towards how the EU, the fact that the EU is trying to handle this topic. Even if you're pro-Ukraine, you shouldn't be letting this into the hands of the EU or Ursula von der Leyen. This is something that the member states should be arranging for themselves in their own interests.
Interesting. Let's introduce our second topic. As we said in the beginning, EU ministers agree faster crackdown on China. What's going on? Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, well, both in the United States and in Europe, the governments are scrapping the so-called de minimis arrangement, which means that small packages shipped from China into the West, in this case into Europe, no longer can profit from the exception that they don't have to pay sort of the customs fee. The threshold was sort of packages worth less than 150 euro. Of course, there was a lot of sort of creativity involved here with companies splitting up packages. And of course, many Chinese products shipped into Europe are not always compliant with product norms and everything. So on the one hand, the people who complain about this, they do have a point that something had to change. On the other, often we're talking about products that are also sold by Western online retailers. They are of course not happy with the success of some of these big Chinese retailers, and they don't like the fact that some of these Chinese products can no longer be sold by them at a super high margin, but are being sold more and more by Chinese online retailers at a much lower margin. So long story short, what the European Union wants to do, or has decided effectively, is to also start levying these packages. This will ultimately hit consumers. But more worryingly is that the European Union also, they want some kind of a more simple €2 fee on each package. And you will never guess where that €2 must go to, obviously to the EU budget, according to the European Commission. Now, this still has to be agreed. It's just a proposal. But yeah, we see it all coming together again. Justified concerns about some, border influx that are being abused for pure protectionist purposes, ultimately at the expense of European consumers.
So what's particularly interesting about this is that, as you mentioned, Peter, this fee that is being collected for every small parcel sent into the EU is being collected by the European by the EU itself. Now, normally, when a member state of the EU is engaging in some sort of protectionist measure, obviously that wouldn't be allowed. That's against the EU, the standards that we have for trade within the EU. So this is something that it sort of, I think it sort of violates the nature of the EU in this sense, because this means that they're imposing something that they're principally opposed to, right? They're imposing essentially a tariff of sorts on certain Chinese exports, but they're collecting the money, like the revenue from this themselves. They're not allowing the member states to do that. So it's the rules are only for the member states, but not for the EU centrally. They can do whatever they want, and they can abandon all of their fancy words about free trade as long as it benefits their geopolitical interests in certain aspects. And I'm not really opposed to taking action against Chinese retailers that are obviously abusing the European market in this way, because that's basically what these retailers, Shein and Temu, that are being targeted right now, that's essentially what they're doing. They're selling low quality goods. They're flooding the European market essentially, and it's not really, they're not really a constructive contributor on the market of goods in Europe, is my actual point of view here. But this is being done in such a hypocritical way that you can't help but wonder, what is the other red line that the EU is going to cross in order to achieve its larger geopolitical goals. In this case, what other principle are they able to violate this way, and actually seeming to get away with it as well? But I think there's a lot of public and political support actually to crack down on these these very cheap retailers that are based in China like this. But obviously this should be, again, ringing some alarm bells in Europe about where the EU is heading.
It's time to introduce our last topic. EU is changing its mind about green policies. What's going on here?
Well, what we see is that for European citizens, green policies are no longer a top priority, to put it mildly, and politics is thankfully finally following. So during the first Ursula von der Leyen term, there was the Green Deal, lots of super expensive green regulations that were passed, and now the Commission has proposed a series of changes, the so-called omnibus packages, basically big legislative changes that incorporate a lot of watering down of some of the worst excesses of some of the worst green regulations. And thankfully, the European Parliament has consented to first out of 6 packages, I think, if I'm not mistaken, which is a good step in the right direction. Notably, as has been picked up by some Brussels-based media like Politico, the European People's Party, which is sort of the centrist party and the biggest faction in the European Parliament, has been working together with more right-wing factions. Some left-wing journalist has described these factions as far right. That is, of course, laughable if you know that there's a number of political parties in there, for example, from the former Czech Prime Minister, the current Belgian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni of Italy. You may agree or not with these people. It's totally fair to disagree with them, but I think when people hear the word or the brand far right, they think about violent brown shirts that are marching on the street, and that are using undemocratic methods. And I don't think it's fair to describe these parties. They are simply right-wing conservative, and even when it comes to right-wing policies, many of them, especially when it comes to the economy, they are not exactly right-wing. I would say they tend more to the left. They do unite, however, in their opposition to excessive central planning and experimental green policies that are ultimately also not good for the environment. And it's very wise that the EPP therefore has now reached out to them, and that we now have a great precedent to build upon for the next few years to go further and to scrap more of this regulation. And then, of course, we can think of the ban on the combustion engine, which is frankly crazy. It's destroying the European car industry. Now the EP has scrapped the sort of due diligence regulations, which was forcing companies to track down their supply chains to see if there were no social or environmental violations, which is of course a massive bureaucracy for companies. But there's also the deforestation regulation, which does the same, specifically for deforestation, also to companies trying to import into Europe, which has put the EU on a collision course with trading partners, not just America. Trump has obtained an exemption from the deforestation regulations, but also Indonesia, Malaysia, Brazil, and Malaysia, for example, they're angry about this. They say, look, we have been improving deforestation and now we are rewarded with a monstrous new bureaucracy. So this is the growth area of the world, Southeast Asia. So you would expect if the EU wants to continue on its mission to open up trade, that it's not sending its trading partners a list with bureaucratic directives. They are expected to implement. So in a nutshell, a step in the right direction, and for once the European Parliament doing something good.
Thank you, Peter and Elias, for your insights today.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.